Churches of Christ present Speaking the Truth in Love, a program bringing you life's answers from the Word of God.
Hello and welcome to the program today. This program is brought to you by the Churches of Christ in the KAIT TV viewing area, and each of these congregations extends to you a warm welcome and invites you to come and visit and study with them about the great salvation that Jesus Christ made available to all of us. If you have any questions about your salvation, if you have any other Bible subject that you really want to talk about with someone and that you're concerned about, then please feel free to contact any of the Churches of Christ that are in your area. My name is Larry McFadden. I am the minister of the Hickory Ridge Church of Christ, and I would look forward to having you in our service, or just call me at the office there anytime you choose. And if you have a discussion that you'd like to be involved in with me, I'd be delighted. And what we've been doing for these few weeks is looking at the list of people of faith who are mentioned in a sermon. We don't really know who the author is, but he wrote it down, and it's addressed to the Hebrews. That is, it's addressed to people who are Jewish Christians in the first century. And in chapter 11 of that discussion, after going through the Old Testament and helping the Jewish people who had become Christians to understand how The things that happened in ancient times actually still serve as an example for us today, and we can learn valuable lessons in how to be people of faith. But in chapter 11, he lets us know that faith is the key to living for God. You can do things that are not out of faith just because you think this would be good for me to do, and it really has nothing to do with God or salvation. But if you do things out of faith, if you say, this is what God said, and because God said this, even though I may not understand why God said this, I'm going to do what pleases Him. And so that list of people who lived that way, people who came into contact with God, they learned about Him, they knew about Him, maybe even God spoke to them, but they decided, this is the way my life is going to be lived. I'm going to live to please God. Whatever He asked me to do, I'm going to do that. And anything that God does not want me to do, anything that would displease Him, I'm not going there. And so in that chapter, we have a listing of people, and as you go back to the very beginning of Genesis, and you begin reading through the book of Genesis, you realize that those people, as we are told in the New Testament, were people who are subject to the same temptations to do wrong that we are. Granted, the rules that God gave them may be different from the rules that we have today, but the principle is basically the same, as God calls upon people to become like Him and do the things that He would do and honor Him by doing what He asks of them. And if we choose to do that, God will bless us as He did them. And if we choose not to do that, then God's not going to bless us. Instead, He is going to cause us to suffer the consequences that just naturally follow not doing what God requires. Well, in our previous studies, the last one in particular, we talked about a man who was known and still is known as the father of the faithful. His name is Abram or Abraham, and he was a man who, when put to the test, was willing to go to whatever degree he needed to of obedience in order to please God. And we noted there at the end of that lesson that Abraham was willing even to offer his own son as a sacrifice if God specifically said it and said, this is what I want you to do. As it turns out, God stopped him, provided a sacrifice, a ram on that occasion. Abraham did not have to follow through. He proved that he was going to be faithful to God. No matter what God asked of him, he was going to do it. Well, in the Hebrew letter, there's a further discussion of those heroes of faith. There are a number of them listed. And then, as preachers do sometimes, evidently he felt he was going too long in his sermon, and so he just says, well, I don't have time to talk about everybody I'd like to talk about. And that's the point at which people in the audience say, oh good, he's going to cut this short. We won't have to listen to a real long sermon. But here's the way it's put in the Hebrew letter. Chapter 11 and verse 32, excuse me. And what more shall I say? After he's named several people and how they've proven their faith, what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets. And then he notes some of the things they did out of faith. Well, it's interesting to me that I don't have time, but all of these are people you could study, he says. Suppose someone said, name the top 5 stories of the Bible that are familiar to people. What are the most familiar stories in the Bible? Well, chances are one of those fellas who's mentioned there, David, would show up and you'd say, well, that list wouldn't be complete without at least telling the story of David killing the giant. And sure enough, as you go back through the Old Testament and you read those stories of faith and people who lived by faith, that story just stands out. There are 2 books of the Bible that are fully dedicated to telling the story of David's life as an adult. But then half of the book of 1 Samuel, talks about David and his early life. And throughout all of this, we discover that this story is so exciting, so thrilling, that children know it, that adults know it, I know it, and I'm still learning things from David and the life that he lived. Like those other heroes of faith, he wasn't sinless either. And the Bible points out his sins. He wasn't a perfect man, but he was a man who keeps coming back to God. If he makes an error of judgment, in other words, if he commits a sin, he comes back to God and he says, I did that. I was wrong. I repent. And I'm going to do my best not to do anything like that ever again. There's a man of faith in God. God, I trust you. And even though I'm weak sometimes, I'm still determined that I'm going to do things your way. Well, that was David. But you know, a lot of adults fail to value this account of David and the giant because for some reason we think, well, that's a story for kids. No, it's not. It excites children. It did when I was a boy. It excited me to know that there was a superhero. He didn't have any superpowers. He was a good shot with a sling and a rock, but he was just so outstanding in doing what was right that God blessed him and took care of him. And then when you read through all of his life, you see that when David made mistakes, it showed up with heartache in his family. Sometimes people suffered because David made mistakes. And there's a challenge to me as I go through the life of David as a father and as a grandfather. I need to be careful with my children, my grandchildren. I need to be careful with the choices that I make because those things can come back to haunt my family even after I'm gone, as they did with David, by the way. But let's go back and look at the story of David and particularly 1 Samuel chapter 17. David is in his teens at this time, and David has already established a reputation. But keep in mind that he's the youngest of Jesse, his father's sons. Jesse's got this whole row of sons, and all the rest of them have gone off to join the army. And they're all grown, still young, but they've joined the army, and they're fighting with King Saul against the Philistines. And David, as he has since he was big enough to put him out there, and the other boys got big enough to go off to war, David is at home. He's out in the fields and the meadows, and he's roaming the hills and the valleys, and he's making sure that that herd of, or flock of sheep that belongs to his father is well fed and well watered, and they're safe from any predators. And that's the David that we're introduced to. And he's got a lot of free time as a shepherd. And so in his free time, he practices with that sling of his. David is interested in singing and interested in music, and so he writes a lot of songs. He even invents some musical instruments appropriate at that day and that time that would allow him to develop his musical ability. And it's possible that people would kind of, his brothers, you know, we're all big soldier guys, and we do things that men do, and you're off singing songs and playing on your instruments and taking care of the sheep, and that's good enough for you, David. That's all you're good for. But then comes the day. And on this day, God sends his servant, prophet Samuel, to Jesse's house. And when he arrives at Jesse's house, Jesse's a little bit uncomfortable because when the preacher pays a visit and you don't know anything wrong in the family, you begin to wonder. And so as Samuel comes to the door, Jesse's uneasy and he says, "What's wrong? What are you here for?" And Samuel brushes that aside. "Oh, I'm here because God sent me. It's going to be good. Call your sons together." Well, they called all those sons except for David, who's off out there with the sheep, the little boy. And keep in mind, this is in an earlier time from chapter 17 of 1 Samuel. And at that point, Samuel starts down the line, starting with the oldest. Oh, he's a good-looking young man. maybe he's the one. And God says, no, that's not him. And he works his way down the line, and he's gone through all the sons, and God says, nope, not any of these. So Samuel turns then to Jesse and says, is this all the sons you've got? Well, there's David down there in the pasture with the sheep. That's all he does. Well, bring him in. And when he came through the door, God said to Samuel, I don't know how he did that. It's just that Samuel knew that's the one. He anointed him and said, you're going to take Saul's place as king one of these days. Well, that day's over. Time passes. Now, those young men are back with Saul, and the Philistines are on that side of the valley, and the Israelites are on this side of the valley. They're gathered up, and like armies who fight hand-to-hand combat in those days, they're ready for the battle. And then this unusual thing takes place. There's this one person who comes through the ranks of the Philistines, and they see him as he's coming. You couldn't mistake him because he's over 9 feet tall. He'd bump his head on the backboard of any basketball goal around. He's 9 feet tall, over 9 feet tall, and just look at the strength of that man, that body on him. And the man steps out and he says, okay, I'm here to challenge all of you Israelites. Is there anybody willing to face me in battle today? Let's settle this thing right now. Now the Bible says he was a trained warrior from his youth up. They saw that he was going to be a big man when he was very young. He was trained for something that he was just a natural to do. He was a born fighter, a born killer, and he had practiced it for years and years, and he had never lost a battle. He's still standing right there, and other people are dead and gone that challenged him. And so he says to them one morning, anyone want to challenge me? Come on out. Let's fight. And then that evening, is there anybody that wants to challenge me? Come on and let's fight. And it seems like he's a little bit bothered by this. And it goes on day after day after day for 7 weeks almost. And here you are with the Israelite army, and their big guy is their king. Their big guy is Saul, and he is, head and shoulders above anybody else in his army. That's tall. He's 6 feet 6 inches or more tall, and by any standards, if anyone's going to fight that man, it needs to be the king. And Saul said, I'm not doing it. I'm not going out there where that man is. I'm staying in my tent. That's been going on. Well, 40 days have passed when David finally shows up. He's brought some food for his brothers. They may be hungry as soldiers, and he even brought some extra food just for Saul. And David hears, because the giant steps out there just when he arrives, and he hears the challenge. Your God's no God. I challenge anyone that stands up for their God, come and fight me. And David says, so is he going to get away with that? All the soldiers say, go on, especially his brothers, get on back home. You don't have any business here. You're just a boy. David wouldn't let it rest. He went from campfire to campfire, I guess, and asked the people, so what's going to happen here? What can be done for the person that finally does meet this man's challenge? I mean, he can't be allowed to curse our God that way and get away with it. And everybody said, well, Saul has promised that anybody that went out there and defeated him would be tax-free for life and have that pretty daughter of his as a wife. And evidently, there's not a soldier there that thought that pretty daughter of his was pretty enough to die for. They wouldn't do it. Well, David finally made such a ruckus about it that Saul heard, and he called him to him and he said, what's this I'm hearing? David said, I'm ready to go fight him. Saul said, well, all right, if you'll do it. Nobody else is willing to. He's out of ideas altogether. He's at the end of his rope, and he's not going. And David is the only one who's volunteered. So he says, well, here, you can have my armor. And David said, I'll try it on, but no, that's not the way I fight. David said, I'll do it my way because God is going to give me the victory. The battle belongs to the Lord always. That's a principle we read in Scripture. And David draws strength from a source that Saul doesn't understand. Psalm 56, verse 3 and 4. What time I am afraid, I will trust in Thee. In God I will praise His word. In God I will put my trust. I will not fear what flesh can do unto me. With that statement, David draws a line. I'm not going to fight this man based on human standards. I'm going to fight him out of my faith in God and let God make the decision. So the battle was fought. Didn't last long. David picked up some rocks as he went through that little brook there in the valley and headed toward Goliath over on his side of the valley. And Goliath is saying, "Is that it? Is that all you got?" And he then, in looking at David, says, I'll feed you to the dogs and the birds. I'll get rid of you in no time at all. Just come on, little man. And I realize that I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but that's the gist of the story, that this giant who has never been defeated sees this kid walking toward him. In fact, he starts running toward him, and Goliath then starts in his direction. He doesn't understand some things. You see, David told King Saul, "I've been in battle before." "Oh, really?" "Yeah, in keeping the sheep, I had to fight a bear, and I had to fight a lion who had come to kill the sheep and take them away and eat them." And he said, "I won, but it wasn't me. It was God." You see, David already understood that he was special to God because there's been a promise made to him. And that promise is that he's going to be king someday. And David is relying on the promises of God. And God makes a lot of promises to His people, by the way. But He made that specific promise to David: you're going to be king someday. And David trusts what God has to say. Now, there are three kinds of faith in this story. There's the faith of Goliath, the giant. He has faith in himself. I've never been defeated. I'm good. I can kill anybody. No one can defeat me. So he's thinking faith in myself is going to help me win this battle. Then there are those soldiers who are on the Israelite side, including Saul, who are cowering. And every time the giant comes out, if he takes a step toward them, they step back or turn maybe their backs. They don't want to face him. No. What they need is kind of reminiscent of Thomas in the New Testament. Thomas said, "I won't believe that Jesus is risen from the dead unless I actually see with my own eyes and touch with my own hands the places where the nails went in." And of course, as soon as Jesus stepped into His presence, my Lord and my God. But you see, what those soldiers are doing is saying, if someone will prove it to me, like Saul, if someone will prove to me that that giant can be faced, then I'll go fight, but not till then. And here's David who says, I don't need somebody else's example. My faith is in God. I don't need to be shown by someone else that it can be done. I know it can be done because God's made promises and God's going to protect me, and so I'm going to put my faith in God. The courage that the giant had was from the faith he had. Wasn't good enough. The lack of courage on the part of these soldiers, I mean, they were in the army after all, but that's not enough in this particular battle. And their faith is in, well, if someone would show me, if someone would just do this, then I know that it could be done. Until then, I don't know that it can be done. You believe Mount Everest can be climbed? There were people who thought it couldn't be until someone did it. And I noticed on TV the other day, there was a whole line of people, more than ever before, lined up one after the other like they're in a movie theater or something, but instead they're climbing through the snow, each one of them thinking, I'm going to conquer this giant because somebody else did it before me. And all those teenage boys out there saying, I can run a 4-minute mile because it's been done by somebody else. But here's David who says, I can do this. Picked up those rocks, headed toward the giant, and he embedded that rock that he used in that man's brain. He picked that small spot and it embedded right there in his brain. So you find, well, I'm thinking of an example from the movie The Patriot, where Mel Gibson, one of his sons has been shot right there in front of the whole family and is dying, and in fact dies. Another son is being taken off to be executed by the British Army. And he takes these two little boys of his and runs with them and says, when they reach the point they're going to ambush the folks who have that older son now, what have I always told you? And they say, aim small, miss small. That's David's philosophy. I'm not shooting for his body. I'm going to hit him where I can kill him. And that's what David does. And then I think also in that same movie where Mel Gibson then is praying to the Lord and he says, make me fast and accurate. That's David. Lord, make me fast and accurate with this. I'm going to aim small. I'm not going to miss because I know what I'm doing. I've done it before. Kill the bear, kill the lion. This giant's no problem. David killed that giant. The soldiers on both sides are shocked. The Philistine army, when they saw David pull that sword from the giant's scabbard and then cut his head off and hold it up, that army is terrified as they see that, and they turn and run. The Israelite army says, wow, it can be done. They rush, engage the enemy, and the battle's over before you realize it, with the enemy slaughtered. And David then is victorious. And he goes back home to keep the sheep until God calls him to become king. Do you have faith in God like the faith of David? You'll face any giant that confronts you in your life.
If you have a Bible question, would like to receive a free Bible correspondence course, would like a copy of 2 free books, Why I'm a Member of the Church of Christ, and Basic Bible Lessons, please contact the Nettleton Church of Christ. Speaking the Truth in Love can be viewed online. Speaking the Truth in Love is brought to you by these area churches of Christ.
Jesus saves, Jesus saves.